Okay, awesome. All right, so chapter 3 is simply titled the United States Constitution. Not a very clever title, in my opinion, but last chapter we were talking about the historical events. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of history in the sense of kind of the certain documents that basically influence the U.S. Constitution here. But we're going to get into, with like this chapter, kind of the structure of the U.S. Constitution. All right, concepts like federalism, concepts like separation of powers, checks and balances, things that I'm sure you at least have heard or at least familiar with. All right, and then we'll delve into kind of what the articles dealing with the branches of government, and then the chapter 4 is dealing with the amendments, specific amendments. Okay, all right. So the first definition of it is basically what is the U.S. Constitution, which were basically the overall arching theme of this course. The test that you have to take on this course to graduate a couple of years in the future here, all right, or like for Bailey, like in May, right? Simply, Constitution is an agreement between the United States, between the citizens of the United States and the government, that the people will grant powers to the government. That's your standard textbook kind of Webster's dictionary. And remember, a constitution is simply just kind of like a written plan of government. Right? It gives legitimacy. It gives a kind of sense of order on things. Again, government is one of these things where it's kind of it's old as civilization itself, the maintaining essentially structure. Right? So with this, before we delve into the U.S. Constitution, and there's a U.S. Constitution. I think it's this. I think I have a copy of this. Oh, that's the Declaration of Independence. So, where's it going? All right. Sorry about that. Oh, it's going back like that. So there are some. I'm going to skip that. There are some historical. Sorry about that. Influences, documents that have a great influence on the U.S. Constitution, and we talked a little bit about stuff like the Magna Carta. Having a kind of an influence on the Declaration of Independence and that. There's a couple of these early, if they're not labeled as constitutions, but kind of written plans of government that have set the groundwork for when we get into the U.S. Constitution. The first one in the 17th century, 1620 to be exact, is something called the Mayflower Compact. A compact is kind of another term for an agreement, right? And so Thanksgiving, we celebrate, it's kind of related to this group of people that we refer to as pilgrims, right? Everybody's heard this. They're the pilgrims are essentially kind of a classification of a larger kind of religious movement called Anabaptists, right? And in many parts of Europe, these guys were kind of were odd, right? And the pilgrims, the Puritans, if you will, were essentially kind of looking for religious freedom in the New World from the Church of England, the Anglican Church. All right, now it's named Mayflower Compact because of the ship that the 102 people that kind of were on. Not all of them pilgrims. All right, the ones that weren't pilgrims were referred to by them as strangers, if you will. All right, but initially this was a expedition that was funded by the Virginia Company, which was a trading company that had ties to the royal government in England. King James officially chartered it. And so the Mayflower was actually supposed to land in Virginia. It got off course and landed up in Massachusetts. As a result, there was a dispute between the pilgrims and the strangers, saying that because this was off track and did land in Virginia, that the whole kind of agreements that they had made before they left were null and void. All right. So this came out of a kind of a possible conflict by this small group of settlers here. All right. And what ends up happening with this is that the 102 signers, passengers, 41 signed this kind of agreement to establish kind of this idea of a government, all right, within this kind of small settlement. All right. And so this is the kind of the signing of the agreement here on the actual Mayflower. Now, this is where apparently they had landed. And there's famously the idea that they had landed on what's called Plymouth Rock. They believe this is the actual rock that which the first settlers kind of stepped upon there. Some of it is based on myth, if you will. But the importance of it is that it kind of lays out this concept of popular sovereignty, right? Which basically means the consent of the governed. Consent means basically kind of the basically agreement of the majority, all right? The right of this comes from the people. So this is kind of an example. You can almost kind of say that the Mayflower kind of colony here was an example maybe of a direct democracy, right, that we had talked about in the last chapter. All right. And with this, they introduced a concept of a preamble, which is just an introduction on what their goals are for their colony. So in the Constitution, before we get into the articles and the amendments and stuff like that, there's a preamble. So the Mayflower Compact these are the two influences on our U.S. Constitution. All right, the concept of popular sovereignty, and then kind of an introduction, if you will. All right, now the actual compact only lasted a few years, all right, but it was enough for essentially, basically, kind of like to maintain some type of order. There was a number of cases in which people had left the area. The winters were pretty tough, and that famous story with the whole Thanksgiving legend and stuff like that is tied in with this. All right, another document. This one's probably not as famous as the Mayflower Compact is in the mid part of the 1600s, about 10, 15 years, I guess, maybe after the Mayflower Compact. Another settlement is in the kind of what we now know as the state of Connecticut. All right, this is called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This was a heavy basis on kind of individual rights of the settlers within the colony. So in many cases, they consider this to be the first true constitution, in the sense that this isn't like basically just kind of maintaining order for the group, but also giving individuals the right of certain things, like kind of like, to pursue their own kind of economic interests, things of that nature. All right, so there's always a debate on which one is actually the first true constitution. But as a constitution itself, by including kind of individual rights, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is usually kind of listed in that. All right, and so another one that is important here when we talk about the Bill of Rights is something that was written in Virginia, written in 1786 by Thomas Jefferson, who was, I believe at the time, a member of the Virginia, the House of Burgesses, called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So this was a great influence, obviously, when we get into the amendments on the First Amendment, right? And Jefferson was one of these guys that had this concept of individual liberty. He was, when we talked about the convention later, he's one of the anti-federalists, right, who insisted that this new government, if it didn't list specific rights like freedom of religion, freedom of expression, assembly, stuff like that, that the government could take it away, right? So this was written after the Declaration of Independence. All right, so this is going to have a great influence here on the First Amendment, and then the goals of the U.S. Constitution as laid out, and we'll talk about, kind of come back to these and refer to them. Essentially, one idea, which particularly Jefferson was a big advocate for, is the concept of limited government. So, a government with specific restrictions on its power, right? That is essentially later kind of added into the Bill of Rights. All right, basically what individuals can do and what the government is kind of limited on kind of enforcing. Also, the concept of majority rule, which seems like a pretty easy concept to understand. All right, the larger number of people, if we vote here, let's go to, let's take notes or go to sleep, and let's say, 5 of us vote yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 3 of us vote no. We're taking notes. The 3 of us lose, all right? But also, too, the concept with this is of protecting also minority rights, meaning basically not just kind of overrunning those who aren't always in agreement with the majority, all right? And so that's the provision included to protect the rights of those who are allowed to kind of express their views openly and freely. This is a key component to a kind of like a Republican form of democracy. Right, is this idea that you should be, while you may not, your kind of vote may not be implemented into essentially law or into kind of government, that you have the right to express your opposition, right? And that ties in with the powers of the people. the Constitution here is kind of an emphasis also on the rights and protections, like I said, is listed in the Bill of Rights. All right. So there's this kind of balance between majority and minority rights within our Constitution, all right, which in many cases kind of doesn't always transcend. Like obviously, when we talk about kind of the Constitution, kind of adding amendments, things kind of change over time. Like for a long period of time, women weren't given the right to vote. African Americans weren't given the right to vote. Right? Things can change as a result of kind of the expression of the minorities. All right, of the minority rights. And then the system of what we call federalism. All right, establishing of a federal system, where power is divided between a national and state government. Usually, what we'll have is basically federal. It's kind of the top layer. And then right below that is state. A lot of this is kind of played out in the courts in many cases and within the Constitution, like you have certain amendments like the 9th and 10th Amendments that tend to be somewhat vague, saying that kind of rights that aren't specifically kind of granted to the federal government should be granted to the people in the states. That leaves for a little bit of open-endedness on certain things as we, as kind of time goes on. Like regulating certain things like air travel or regulating infrastructure and stuff like that. All right. And so I'm going to play this video here that kind of explains federalism than I can from this kind of PBS series. Some of it's kind of corny, all right? But I think it does a fairly good job. The guy on there, pretty concise, but he's also tends to be kind of a little bit of kind of cornball.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about a fundamental concept in American government, federalism. I'm not sorry, you're not even endangered anymore. Federalism is a little confusing because it includes the word federal as in federal government, which is what we use to describe the government of the United States as a whole, which is kind of the opposite of what we mean when we say federalism. Confused? Google it. This video will probably come up, and then just watch this video. Or just continue watching this video. So what is federalism? Most simply, it's the idea that in the U.S., governmental power is divided between the government of the United States and the government of the individual states. The government of the U.S., the national government, is sometimes called the federal government, while the state governments are just called the state governments. This is because technically the U.S. can be considered a federation of states, but this means different things to different people. For instance, federation of states means ham sandwich to me. I'll have one federation of states, please. Side of tater tots. Thank you. I'm kind of dumb. In a federal system, the national government takes care of some things, like, for example, war with other countries and delivering the mail, while the state government takes care of other things like driver's license, hunter's license, barber's license, dentist's license, license to kill. That's James Bond, and that's in England, and I hope states don't do that. Pretty simple, right? Maybe not. For one, there are some aspects of government that are handled by both the state and the national government. Taxes. Americans' favorite government activity are an example. There are federal taxes and state taxes. But it gets even more complicated because there are different types of federalism depending on what period in American history you're talking about. Stan, why is history so confusing? Stan, can you tell me? Can you talk, Stan? Basically, though, there are two main types of federalism. Dual federalism, which has nothing to do with Aaron Burr, usually refers to the period of American history that stretches from the founding of our great nation until the New Deal. And cooperative federalism, which has been the rule since the 1930s. Let's start with an easy one and look at dual federalism in the thought bubble. From 1788 until 1937, the U.S. basically lived under a regime of dual federalism, which meant government power was strictly divided between the state and national governments. Notice I didn't say separated because I don't want you to confuse federalism with separation of powers. Don't do it! With dual federalism, there are some things that only the federal government does and some things that only the state governments do. This is sometimes called jurisdiction. The national government had jurisdiction over internal improvements like interstate roads and canals, subsidies to the states, and tariffs, which are taxes on imports and thus fall under the general heading of foreign policy. The national government also owns public lands and regulates patents, which need to be national for them to offer protection for inventors in all the states. And because you want a silver dollar in Delaware to be worth the same as a silver dollar in Georgia, the national government also controls currency. The state government had control over property laws, inheritance laws, commercial laws, banking laws, corporate laws, insurance, family law, which means marriage and divorce, morality, stuff like public lewdness and drinking, keeps me in check, public health, education, criminal laws, including determining what is a crime and how crimes are prosecuted, land use, which includes water and mineral rights, elections, local government, and licensing of professions and occupations. Basically, what's required to draw or a bar or become a barber or become James Bond. So, under dual federalism, the state government has jurisdiction over a lot more than the national government. These powers over health, safety, and morality are sometimes called police power and usually belong to the states. Because of the strict division between the two types of government, dual federalism is sometimes called layer cake federalism. Delicious. And it's consistent with the tradition of limited government that many Americans hold very dear. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, some of you might be wondering, Craig, where does the national government get the power to do anything that has to do with states? Yeah, well, off the top of my head, the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause, and the way that it's been interpreted forms the basis of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. For most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided that almost any attempt by any government, federal or state, to regulate state economic activity would violate the Commerce Clause. This basically meant that there was very little regulation of business at all. Freedom! And this is how things stood, with the U.S. following a system of dual federalism with very little government regulation, and the national government not doing much other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous amounts of territory, and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression happened, and Franklin Roosevelt and Congress enacted the New Deal, which changed the role of the federal government in a big way. The New Deal brought us cooperative federalism, where the national government encourages states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals. The main way that the federal government does this is through dollar bills, y'all. Money is what I'm saying. Can I make it rain? Yeah? All right, I'm doing it. I happen to have cash in my hand right now. Oh yeah, take my federal money, states. Regulate me. Regulator. This money that the federal government gives to the state is called a grant and aid. Grants and aid can work like a carrot, encouraging a state to adopt a certain policy, or work like a stick when the federal government withholds funds if a state doesn't do what the national government wants. Grants and aid are usually called categorical because they're given to states for a particular purpose, like transportation or education or alleviating poverty. There are two types of categorical grants and aid: formula grants and project grants. Under a formula grant, a state gets aid in a certain amount of money based on a mathematical formula. The best example of this is the old way welfare was given in the U.S. under the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. States got a certain amount of money for every person who was classified as poor. The more poor people a state had, the more money it got. Project grants require states to submit proposals in order to receive aid. The states compete for a limited pool of resources. Nowadays, project grants are more common than formula grants, but neither is as popular as block grants, which the government gives out Lego blocks and then you build stuff with the Legos. It's a good time. No, where the national government gives a state a huge chunk of money for something big like infrastructure, which is made with concrete and steel, not Legos, and the state is allowed to figure out how to. The basic type of cooperative federalism is the characteristic type of federalism because it mixes up the state and federal government in ways that makes it impossible to separate the two. Federalism, it's such a culinary delight. The key to this is, you guessed it, Dalla. There's another aspect of cooperative federalism that's really not so cooperative, and that's regulated federalism. Under regulated federalism, the government sets up regulations and rules that the state must follow. Some examples of these rules, also called mandates, are EPA regulations, civil rights standards, and the rules set up by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the government gives the state's money to implement the rules, but sometimes it doesn't, and they must comply anyway. That's called an unfunded mandate, or as I like to call it, an unfunded mandate. That's no money, no fun. A good example of this is OSHA regulations that employers have to follow. States don't like these, and Congress tried to do something about them with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA, but it hasn't really worked. In the early 21st century, Americans are basically living under a system of cooperative federalism with some areas of activity that are heavily regulated. This is a stretch from the original idea that federalism will keep the national government small and have most government functions belong to the states. If you follow American politics, and I know you do, this small government ideal should sound familiar because it's the bedrock principle of many conservatives and libertarians in the U.S. As conservatives made major political inroads after the 1970s, a new concept of federalism, which was actually kind of an old concept of federalism, became popular. It was called, surprise, New Federalism, and it was popularized by Presidents Nixon and Reagan. Just to be clear, it's called New Federalism, not surprise, New Federalism. New federalism basically means giving more power to the states, and this has been done in three ways. First, block grants allow states discretion to decide what to do with federal money. And what's a better way to express your power than spending money? Or not spending money, as the case may be. Another form of new federalism is devolution, which is the process of giving state and local governments the power to enforce regulations, devolving power from the national to the state level. Finally, some courts have picked up the cause of new federalism through cases based on the 10th Amendment, which states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or or to the people. The idea that some powers, like those police powers I talked about before, are reserved by the states has been used to put something of a brake on the Commerce Clause. So as you can see, where we are with federalism today is kind of complicated. Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton seem to favor new federalism and block grants. But George W. Bush seemed to push back towards regulated federalism with laws like No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It's pretty safe to say that we're going to continue to live under a regime of cooperative federalism with a healthy dose of regulation thrown in. But many Americans feel that the national government is too big and expensive and not what the framers wanted. If history is any guide, a system of federalism with most of the government in the hands of the states is probably not going to happen. For some reason, it's really difficult to convince institutions to give up powers once they've got them. I'm never giving up this power. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course Government and Politics, producing a...
Okay. All right. So again, he was getting into a lot of more kind of in-depth stuff that we'll get that if we get to chapter 8 on the kind of the concept of state governments, we'll talk a little bit more detail about. But essentially, what we're kind of breaking this down into, we have the federal government, national powers have certain kind of rights, certain things they can do. The states have specific certain things they can do. All right, like established local governments, like a lot of times, like Collinsville, cities like this have charters that basically they have to kind of appeal to this, basically kind of like apply to the state to just kind of operate. Right now here, like setting up schools, that's something generally kind of a state power thing, although the federal government does have a kind of through the Department of Education, some kind of basically federal block grants and funding and stuff like that. All right. And then you see like certain things where they're kind of shared. All right. And so these have like kind of specific terms here. So delegated powers is the term for the powers that are specifically given to the federal government. All right. So like it says, like basically like regulating interstate trade between states, crossing state lines. That is regulated by the federal government. Establishing kind of a national military, stuff like that. Reserve powers and powers held specifically by the states. All right, like a lot in many cases, for even like within federal elections, the states are the ones who determine like kind of like voting, like whether you and recently the issue of like kind of voter ID. Some states have made it a point that you have to have a kind of a picture ID, like a driver's license, to vote. That's generally kind of put under reserve powers, right? Intra-state commerce, trade just within the state, like Illinois or just within Missouri or whatever like that. That's what we call reserve powers. Those are powers kind of reserved to the states. This is like the video set kind of laid out in that vague amendment, which is essentially Amendment 10, all right, which kind of gives the states the kind of powers that weren't specifically given to the federal government, they're given to the states. All right, and then like that area in between there in the Venn diagram is referred to as concurrent powers, powers that the federal and state governments both share. Like both federal and state have the ability to tax, right? So like on your checks, if you're working, you'll see taxes taken out. You'll see taxes taken out for federal, you see taxes taken out for state. All right, so those are like basically the shared powers, what we call concurrent powers. All right, the ones that are kind of in between there. Taxation, like I said, is probably the biggest one. All right, so we'll talk about these. We'll kind of mention these, like I said, in particular when we get into kind of the relationship between states and federal governments if we make it chapter 8 for the most part. All right, so again, breaking down the Constitution. The Constitution is filled with kind of particular ideas that relates to the idea of basically sharing power. All right, the idea, and that was this balance that we had to kind of dating back to basically the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. All right, this idea of trying to make sure that we have a strong central government, but one that isn't too strong, that gives some rights and responsibilities to states and ultimately individuals. All right, so that was the last of the notes, right, for that section. Okay, all right. So tomorrow I'm going to give you guys just a little worksheet from like kind of the Constitution compromise type of worksheets there. This one I believe is on the organization of the Constitution, just a general kind of like talking about the articles and kind of like certain amendments. All right, those of you at home, sorry about the mix up on the video there. I'm done.